Getting it in the first 4 seconds.
I tried.
All right, welcome back. We're here for this hour in General and Housing. Another introductory interview with Michael Harrington, who is the Commissioner of the Department of Labor. We share jurisdiction, not jurisdiction over the Department of Labor, but because we do wages and other benefit programs, like as we're going to work on family medical leave insurance, we do have a direct line in the Department of Labor. Their data will become necessary for us, the data that is available. It's been some time since we've had the Department of Labor in, because during the immediate pandemic, it was mostly about unemployment. So I'd love an introduction. I'm sure we'll have some questions. We've got until 11. And we truly appreciate you coming in and letting us know who you are.
Great. For the record, Michael Harrington, Commissioner, Department of Labor. I'm just going to hand these out. You're welcome to hold on to it or dispose of it, but it's just a brief overview of the department, and I'll kind of use this as a template to walk through the department. We haven't, as the chair mentioned, we haven't been before this committee in great detail over the past, maybe on a few discrete items, but in general, the Department of Labor has about 250 employees. We're predominantly federally funded. Our bigger programs are our workforce development program, which is I think roughly about 90% federally funded, maybe a little less now, and unemployment insurance. But then the other areas include workers' compensation and then labor market data and information. So we also identified on this sheet our wage and hour group. I think that probably relates more to this committee, which again looks at workplace rights and adhering to the things like, there you go, minimum wage and things of that nature. So like I said, about 250 employees. We run 12 regional offices across the state. Our largest, which is a federally certified one-stop career center, job center, is in Burlington. And then the rest of our either offices or areas where we have staff, I say they're not all physical offices. They've kind of morphed over time as the needs of Vermonters has changed, but we have essentially core representation in 11 other areas or regions across the state, and those are satellite job centers. In general, we are, again, mostly federally funded, and then comes general fund. Special fund is what funds are mainly our workers' compensation division, and then interdepartmental transfers is a very small amount. I'm happy to answer questions, but I also just have, if you want them, every 2 years we work with the McClure Foundation. You may have seen this press conference on it, but our labor market information division works on putting out Vermont's most promising jobs. And then we do a lot of our work with employers and job seekers, linking them to our job board or job service and helping them find employment and training opportunities. Again, I'm happy to direct more to the area of purview for this committee, but if you have specific questions, I'm happy to answer them along the way. I have Cameron Wood with me here today. Cameron not only serves as our appointed director of the unemployment insurance program, but he also serves as our policy and legislative affairs director. He has worked for Ledge Council in the past, so he's keenly aware of the inner workings of this building, and many of you may have worked with Cameron in the past, but came to the department back in 2016. So if there are specific questions, I know you're going to want to talk about some unemployment benefits as they relate to the waiver process. So Cameron can also help answer those questions as well.
Sure. Let's just start with a clarification for us. Workers' comp and unemployment, they're funded differently. I mean, they all come out of our paycheck. They're part of our payroll taxes, but they serve, you have different matches. If you could just explain where it is, because the unemployment fund would go.
Yep.
We'll start the conversation about the waiver with, say, pandemic. prior to the pandemic, I think this was the last time we chatted with Cameron, was that in 2019, there was a conversation about the state was in a consortium with 3 or 4 other states to share the redevelopment of the unemployment system.
Yeah.
And at some point that fall after we left and before the pandemic, I didn't know this, but the consortium fell apart. And then we had the pandemic and we found out that, publicly that we're still using at that time we're using the COBOL system still. And so I'm just curious to know what the status of the mechanization or the modernization of that system is.
To the initial comment about funding and how they're structured, just a point of clarification for folks in the room. So the funding for both the unemployment insurance benefits, but also the workers' compensation program doesn't come directly out of workers' paychecks. So the employer pays on both of those. Now you could say tangentially it impacts workers maybe, but for unemployment insurance, there's what it costs to run the program, and then all of the benefits come out of the unemployment insurance trust fund. So the predominantly the money that comes to run the program comes from the federal government in an allocation we get every year. All the contributions, direct contributions from employers, whether they're for-profit or nonprofit, in our area we call them taxable or reimbursables. All of those contributions go directly into the trust fund. And the only thing that the trust fund dollars can be used for is to pay benefits for unemployed individuals. So we can't dip into the trust fund to pay for other operational costs or anything of that nature. On the workers' compensation side, that program is what we provide is essentially mediation among the employer, the injured worker, and then the insurer. So if there is a difference of opinion on whether the injured worker or the incident is compensable, the department will come in to essentially negotiate or determine a settlement in those cases. And that funding is based on essentially a percentage of the premiums paid by employers. So we don't pay workers' comp insurance out. That's through private insurers. And the funding for the program comes from the premiums that employers pay to the insurers for workers' compensation insurance.
Which are dropping.
Yeah. And again, we've seen a number of different reasons for that, but essentially it's based on, what have been the prior liabilities, also what is the projected liabilities, as well as more people paying into the workers' compensation, coverage pool, then that can also drop the cost of the premiums as well. But the safer industries, so one of the things we've done in the past is taken like a high cost industry like logging and worked with both the logging industry, forest parks and recreation, Department of Financial Regulation, and I developed training programs and other instances that insurers would use to determine whether an industry is safe or less safe. And we were able to also decrease rates in the logging industry as well, making it more affordable for employers in that industry. Also, under the Workers' Compensation and Safety Division, we have things like the Vermont Occupational Safety and Health Administration, so VOSHA, which is, there's Fed OSHA, and then there's also Vermont OSHA, and as well as our Project WorkSafe, which is the educational side of VOSHA. So we will go into employers, identify hazards. They have an obligation to fix those hazards, but when we find hazards through the Project WorkSafe program, they're not fined. There's no charges issued or liabilities under that. They're just required to mitigate the issue that they find. And then we also run the passenger tramway program. So we inspect all the chairlifts across the state and conveyance systems on Ski Mountain. So, but to the unemployment insurance modernization piece, and Cameron knows this better than I do, but it goes back before he or I were with the department, probably before many of you. And Vermont was in a number of different consortia on a way to try to, the feds decided they were going to put money out to states, specifically states that were in consortiums to modernize their UI systems. I would say probably, I don't know, 2% of those consortiums succeeded. The rest failed. Some failed quite largely in terms of the amount of money that was wasted. We were in a consortium right before the pandemic. We had been in that consortium for probably going on 5 years. And we had yet to see any type of workable product come out of that consortium. So one of the biggest challenges with that consortium, maybe different than others that had succeeded, in those that had succeeded, they had identified a vendor and the consortium had a contract with a vendor. In the consortium we were in, one of the states was actually the developing state. So the state of Idaho was not only the developer of the system, but they also were the recipient of most of the funding, right? So what we found is that the needs of the lead state came first, and they were using the funding to build the system that they wanted, but not necessarily the system that the other states in the consortium wanted. And we finally got to the point where our federal funding ran out and we were going to have to start using state funding. We were also about 1.5 years away from any type of full launch. So the consortium dissolved in late January, early February of 2020. So right before the pandemic. But again, we were still 1.5 years away. So it's not like we would have had a product to use for the pandemic. And we've now started the process of identifying a vendor, and the legislature did provide funding to the department for modernization. So we're going through that procurement process right now. From the pandemic side, I think we're all aware, but we on average handle about 15 to 16,000 unemployment claims, and it's a much more complex system. But essentially, the number of people that receive benefits in some way, shape, or form in 2019 was about 16,000 people. In 2020, that number was about 100,000. In 21, it was about 55,000. And it's slowly come down. This year is actually even lower than 2019. And that's because I think of such a tight labor market that we're in right now. So the other thing that I throw out as typically a caveat for folks, because you'll hear it misrepresented in the media a lot, is that there's the way we calculate the number of employed and unemployed people in the state of Vermont, but those numbers are different than the number of people actually collecting benefits. So in the state of Vermont right now, there's like 8,700 unemployed people, but the number of people actually collecting benefits is more like 4,000. At one point, the number of people collecting benefits was actually as low as like 1,500, which was like a record low for us. And that isn't like the same person all the time, right? So again, people come on and off unemployment benefits. It is one of the more complex programs. I'd probably put it right up there with healthcare. Because eligibility is not just determined once. You have initial determinations that would determine whether you're eligible, but then as a claimant, you have to certify each week that you're unemployed. So you're always certifying for the prior week and receiving benefits for the prior week. So every week, a claimant has to go in and answer a series of questions saying, did you work at all during the prior week? Did you receive any earnings for the prior week? Did you conduct your mandated work search for the prior week? And then you have to factor in everything from severance and vacation pay when somebody leaves to whether they're paying child support. It's a very complex system in terms of how we calculate somebody's benefit amount.
So I'll take that as a wide way to start to
Sure.
the question here. 80 to 100,000 people got unemployment.
Yep.
There was first question is we went into this pandemic with an exceedingly healthy unemployment
Yes.
trust fund.
Yep.
Is it still healthy?
It's still healthy. It's not where it was. So the entire system for unemployment, especially on the tax or employer contribution side, was reworked in 2010 following then the Great Recession, because during the Great Recession, we actually bankrupted the system and had to borrow from the federal government. A lot of states, like they'll keep their trust funds at exceptionally low amounts, and they've come to the belief that it's just better and easier to borrow every time there's some type of surge in unemployment. So Vermont decided back then that was not the role of our trust fund, and I think rightfully reworked the tax structure and to ensure that we had a solvent trust fund so we didn't have to get into a borrowing situation. So by the time the pandemic hit, for comparison, during the last recession, the Great Recession, we had about $330 million in the trust fund. We ended up borrowing, I think, something around like 80 million to 90 million. And going into the pandemic, we had about 550 million in our trust fund. Granted, there were a lot more federal supports that came out during the pandemic, so we did not have to tap in to the trust fund to the same degree we did during the Great Recession. But at one point, I think we were down to about 225 million in the trust fund. So we're slowly climbing. We're I think around 250 to 260, and we're on a trajectory to again. I think we were one of the states that fared the best because we also a lot of states dumped a lot of ARPA funding and other federal funding into their trust funds to keep them alive, and we didn't have to do that. But I think some would argue, was 550 million excessive? Because it all comes off the backs of employers. And so there's a question of like, how do you, once you reach that solvent level, do you just keep filling the pot for the rainy day, or do you try to find ways to provide relief for employers once you've reached that solvent position? So Matt Barowitz, our economist, also does an annual UI trust fund report, which will come out in the next couple of weeks. So we'll also make sure you get a copy of that. But
we'll have that in just to do the labor market stuff.
Yeah, that would be great.
So there's a question.
Yeah.
So I was approached by an attorney at Legal Aid who works with the department on an issue where during the pandemic, so many people, we all did the best we could, et cetera, but there were overpayments. And those overpayments were identified by the federal government, and apparently there's a way to apply for a waiver for paying them back, where the federal government has said, we understand that this was not done fraudulently, in cases that can be proven that weren't fraudulent. But there's a waiver. And I believe the question from the attorney was, is it being advertised? Can it please be advertised to the point where people know, because people are being dinged for their overpayment, and they may not know that they have an opportunity to have that overpayment waived.
Yeah. So yes, there is a waiver option. It's the name blanket waiver is really nice, but it isn't just a like strike of the pen and like all is forgiven. So there is an internal process that we have to go through still to determine whether or not fraud occurred or not. So all the claims still need to be reviewed. We are offering to waive overpayments in certain cases where it's federal money, where waivers are allowed of overpayments. So it's happening. I think the question here is, how are we advertising it? How are we making sure that people are aware of it? Some of that is on the scale of priority and the challenges we have with staffing right now. Also making sure we don't find ourselves in a situation where we promote something and we create another backlog in a system that's already backlogged, because it will quickly overrun the resources we have. So needing to find a way to do that in a very deliberate and meaningful way. I think in theory, we are supportive of making sure people are aware, but we've also run into a lot of challenges on how to actually do that and not just create another backlog where people are waiting 6 months or a year for a determination from us. All of our decisions also come with appeal rights. So there are 3 levels of appeals. So we do have a number of people who appeal their decisions, both at the administrative level, the first level of the appeal, and to the Employment Security Board, which is the second level, and then they can also appeal to the Supreme Court. So I'll let Cameron, if he wants to come up and just share, because he can talk more about the blanket waiver process and kind of what our conversations with legal aid have been.
Sorry.
Good morning.
Welcome.
For the record, Cameron Wood, as the commissioner mentioned, I'm the policy and legislative director for the Department of Labor, and I also serve as the unemployment insurance director, and I've been in that role for, it'll be 7 years next year. So about the overpayment waiver process. So this is very detail oriented and very difficult, not only for us as a department to administer, but to ensure that we're communicating correctly and effectively to the customer to help them understand. And so I will go down a little bit of a rabbit hole, and I hope you all will indulge me for a quick minute. During the pandemic, we were operating 5 separate unemployment insurance programs that provided benefits to claimants. And on top of that, there were 3 separate supplemental programs that we administered for claimants. So there's regular UI, there were 4 tiers of extension benefits, there was the federal PUA program, then there was the additional $600 a week that individuals were receiving in the beginning that turned into $300 a week. There was the LWA program, if you remember, President Trump provided that.
Jargon busting, let's
Lost wage assistance, LWA. PUA is pandemic unemployment assistance.
And
thank you, Mr. Chair.
that's fine. And the PUA was for
Individuals who were not eligible for regular unemployment benefits,
Okay.
primarily those who were self-employed, independent contractors, or just other individuals that were somehow not eligible for regular UI. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
that's fine.
So on top of that, we also had an additional supplemental program that the state provided. A lot of people may not remember, but after the lost wage assistance program expired, the state actually provided an additional $100 a week for 5 weeks there in late calendar year 2020. So typically, we do not waive overpayments for regular unemployment insurance. Those are state-funded dollars that come out of our UI trust fund. And we would only waive those overpayments in the event that we found out it was due to some sort of error on the department's end. And then in those situations, we would usually waive them. So we've never had a waiver process in the past. Throughout the pandemic, and then immediately after the pandemic, immediately after these kind of programs closed, the message we were receiving from USDOL is that these benefit programs, we could not waive the overpayments. Keep in mind that most of the programs that I just described, the extension, the PUA program for the self-employed individuals, the additional $300 and $600 a week that was going on individuals' weekly benefit amounts, those were all funded by federal dollars. They were not funded by us, the state of Vermont, or through our trust fund, by our trust fund, I should say. So, as the chair mentioned earlier, it was a very challenging time. We did the best that we could, and we fully understand that there were a lot of benefits that were paid out incorrectly to individuals who were not fraudulent payments, just individuals who may have received some benefits that they may not have been entitled to in the given circumstance. Because most of those dollars are federal dollars, we have to abide by the federal program requirements. So USDOL came out and said that you, state, have the authority to waive certain overpayments in certain circumstances. And there are specific findings that we have to make in order to waive those overpayments. The individual has to be not at fault for the overpayment, and requiring them to repay would be contrary to equity and good conscience. What does that mean? There are specific parameters that USDOL has provided to us to fit within that definition. And so, as the commissioner mentioned a second ago, I would love to just be able to waive all non-fraud overpayments and walk away from this, because I'd much rather be focused on our current program and the current individuals that are filing for unemployment. Again, it was a pandemic. We all recognize the strain that we were in as a department, that our system was in. It's just the reality. We can't do that. We have to make individual findings on each of these claims who have an overpayment that they are not at fault and that repayment would be contrary to equity and good conscience. So the biggest challenge that we run into right now is, as the commissioner was mentioning earlier, we have moving forward, and we did this during the summer and in the fall, we put a notice on our overpayment determinations going to claimants that had a federal CARES Act overpayment that said you can request a waiver and here's how you do so. What we haven't been able to do yet to date is try to go back to all the people that had overpayments already established, because those people have to be given the same opportunity. The other thing we have to be very careful is, as I said, communicating that there are certain programs that a waiver is eligible for and not other programs. And so
I should also point out, what you'll find too is people drew money out of many different programs, right? So it's not easy to say, oh, well, here's all the PUA folks, right? Or here's all the UI folks. Many of these people receive benefits out of 3 or more of these programs. So you literally have to then do the math. And some of those programs we managed using Excel spreadsheets. So they weren't managed out of our UI system. And so you're essentially saying, how do I do the math on the UI system, on the PUA system, which was a completely separate developed system on a completely separate platform, and then all these ancillary programs that were run off of spreadsheets.
And so these are challenges that we face. These are not excuses. These are not us to sit here and say we can't do this, and just wanting to make sure that you all understand the realities on the ground of how difficult these things are to actually do for us. So what we are trying to do, Legal Aid has raised the same concerns with us directly about ensuring that individuals are aware of this. And so what we're trying to do, over the next few weeks, months, is make sure the information is available on our website, easily accessible by individuals there. We're also trying to figure out how we can get the information out to individuals who already have an overpayment established. So one thing we've talked with Legal Aid about is potentially putting that information on the bills, if you will, that we send out to individuals who have an overpayment. These can be very challenging things to do for us because of our unemployment system. So when you think about, well, can't you just go in and add this information to the piece of paper that goes out to people? But a lot of those forms that we generate are actually programmed into our mainframe. So to add a word onto a form, it actually takes a programmer who knows our system well enough to go in and program that into our mainframe system. And so those are some of the biggest challenges that we run into in trying to do this. And so we've been, Legal Aid has let us know that their concerns. I know that they wrote a letter to House Commerce Committee and the Senate Economic Development Committee. Mr. Chair, I'm not sure if that was shared with you or this committee, but we are trying to work with them to figure out how best we can better communicate this out. The reality is we want to make sure that people who did not attempt to collect benefits fraudulently are aware of the overpayment and eligible for that in the event that they meet those criteria from the federal government. The biggest challenge we run into is, as the commissioner mentioned, it is the ability for us to manage the workload. We have significant staffing challenges, just like many other employers, most employers across the state that are trying to hire. We as a state of Vermont are finding it extremely difficult to find qualified individuals for the jobs that we have. People are simply not applying for state jobs at this point, and we have a significant challenge there.
I would also say that a lot of this work is no longer federally funded through federal administrative dollars. So those dollars cease to exist. So I would say disappointed is probably the most appropriate word, although it probably doesn't do justice for the challenges we faced with the federal government in terms of, to give you an example, I think at one point we did the math and the UI program before the pandemic was 98% federally funded. At some point during the program, it was 60% federally funded and 40% came from the state of Vermont, either through ARPA funds or other funds. But they did not adequately fund states going into the pandemic, nor did they adequately fund states for and this is true for kind of all states during the pandemic. We did not get sufficient funding during the pandemic to also scale up our programs and run our programs. And currently, for example, this past program year, the current year we're in where they cut, or was it last program year?
Last federal program.
So halfway through the program year, they also cut our funding by $500,000 as well. So we're currently operating on less funds than we were prior. So again, it's been a challenge with the federal government because they certainly have the expectations and would like us to prioritize certain things, but they're not willing to necessarily fund those activities.
Questions? Representative Chestnut Tanger with that, Howard.
So I know we could go on.
Yeah, sure.
But our time is limited. So I want to ask, I know, during the pandemic, when, the claimants increased 8-fold or 10-fold, and you had to bring in private contractors, people from other agencies and departments and retirees and, all hands on deck. I understand some of the scale of the situation, hampered, of course, by your mainframe computers. And I want to ask about going forward, modernizing the system. And are you able to, first of all, upgrade the computer base and to simplify the system going forward?
So upgrade, yes. We're already out to bid. There's probably only half a dozen vendors out there that have proven UI systems on the market in some way, shape, or form. There are many others that believe they can do it, but in terms of proven systems, there's really only 5 or 6.
Is that hardware to run those systems?
It's software, but yes, it's the actual nuts and bolts of how claims get processed and how taxes get collected and how those determinations are made. So it's the underlying system that all UI systems in the country are built on. There's again, like 5 or 6 vendors that actually supply a proven working system in those cases. And so we are going through the procurement process for that. It's roughly a $33 million project. And the simplification, I think in general, there are things we can do to simplify the system and how we work with the system and how our claimants and our employers engage with the system. So things like user experience or customer experience, a lot more self-service for the employer and the claimant. But a lot of the functions that are performed are federally required functions of the system. So it is, there is very limited ability to go in and change the regulatory piece of the system in terms of how benefits are collected, how eligibility is determined, things of that nature, because those are required.
I will just add real quick from what the commissioner was mentioning. We're still a few years away from a modern system. Once we have the vendor selected, get the contract in place, kick the project off, we expect that to occur this year. We're still potentially.
Still be based on the old IBM?
No, sir.
No, this is a new.
Yeah.
This will be a new, modern, web-based software solution. Yep. But we will, we're still 2-3 years away from it at that point in time. We do expect to have, as the commissioner mentioned, significantly significantly increased ability to interact with our customer to make the process of filing and collecting benefits much easier for them.
A good example of that is prior to the pandemic, there's only so many spaces that you can fill on the form for the mainframe program. So there was no way to take an email address because when the mainframe was built, email addresses didn't exist. So we had no email address contact information for any claimants prior to the pandemic. And the only way we've been able to collect that information is because we moved our initial claims form to a different platform. And so we collect that information through one system that then feeds the data necessary to make the eligibility determination into the mainframe system. So this is a multi-step process to capture the information, make the determinations, and then spit out the information on the back end. We'll eventually have the system that has the functionality to do all of that within one contained system. But it just shows you the complexity. You know, the only way we could communicate with our customers prior to the pandemic, and it's still difficult. So if we want, like, let's say I want to send an email to all the current claimants, I have to have one of our ADS mainframe and tech folks run a report through this third-party system to pull all the email addresses for the current claimants that are filing in our system and have them downloaded into a separate Excel file that we then copy and paste to send an email to them. So
My head just exploded. So.
yeah.
There you go. Representative
I know.
Howard and James.
Thank you. I have a couple of questions.
Sure.
You mentioned staffing. How many vacancies do you currently have?
I think we're at 17% vacancy rate in UI. It seems like for every one person we hire, two leave. It's a challenging environment. We at times have had to institute mandatory overtime to get through backlogs. And certainly with every vacancy, that's just more work on the back of the people that are there. So we, at one point, I think had as many as 150 employees, not counting the third-party vendor we use for our call center. We're now at about, I would say, back down to about 75, 80 employees in UI. But again, we run about a 17 to 20% vacancy rate at any time.
How many employees with more than 5 years experience have left in the past 5 years? Do you know?
A lot, but I couldn't
Yeah.
give the number. A lot.
I will say
Approximately.
more than 5 years of experience in UI, actually not a lot, not a lot. I will forever and always be grateful to our staff at the department for what they endured throughout the pandemic to make sure that Vermonters had the benefits that, you know, helped them get food on the table and keep roof over their head, et cetera. We had many retirees actually come back during the pandemic, volunteer to come back during the pandemic. Most of our staff worked overtime for close to 2 years straight. So I will forever and always be grateful to them and always try to give them the credit that they deserve in a public setting. We haven't had a lot of our senior staff leave. We're actually very fortunate in that regard. Some of them have come up on retirement, and we've had some people retire. But you know, what we're seeing is difficult to bring on new staff, and then sometimes when we get new staff, they leave shortly thereafter. So.
I have one more question. In your regional offices, what are the hours that they operate, and are they now open the same hours as they were before COVID?
No to the last part for a couple different reasons. One, so I should clarify, our regional offices are regional job centers, so they are not unemployment offices. So the folks that work in our regional job centers are funded under the Workforce Innovation and Opportunity Act, and they provide reemployment and training services to individuals looking for work. There is one reemployment program that comes out of UI called the RESEA program, and I don't know the whole acronym, but it's Reemployment Services Program. And they also work in the regional offices, but there are not UI staff working in the regional offices because we just don't have the funding to do that. The staff. Our workforce development division runs about a 25% vacancy rate. So the challenge we've had in the field right now is one, making sure we have enough staff to keep offices open, but also it's a switch. And I think the switch is like what we saw with teleworking. It's kind of the same thing. Before the pandemic, people looking for services would come into our offices. So you could literally unlock the door, prop it open, and you'd have staff that were just busy all day helping customers come through the door. That's not the case. The amount of foot traffic into our offices has just bottomed out. And so what we've actually had to do is change the way we think about service delivery and bring the services to the individuals where they are. So we do not offer the same level of open office hours because our staff are now in the field. They're going to different locations, whether it's public libraries or the Community College of Vermont or other on-site, we call it labor on location sites where we're providing services out in the field. Because having them just sit in the office and wait for people to come. All of our federal funding in our workforce development programs that comes from the federal government is based on enrollments in our program. So it does us no good to simply wait for people to come to us. It's all about how many people can we get into our various programs. So we've got a couple different ways we're doing that, and we can certainly come back and talk about those if you want to.
So how do people know that that's available in the libraries or?
Sure. So a lot of it's posted on our website. Most of our hours are posted on our website. We do some appointment only. They all are also posted on the building as well. But we do have walk-in hours. So we try to at least at multiple times at different times throughout a week on various days and times have walk-in hours still. But most of it is appointment only. And again, there really just aren't a lot of people seeking our services. So we're really out there trying to recruit people into our various programs, working with our tech centers, working with like the emergency housing program that comes out of AHS or with DOC for individuals who are exiting incarceration, right? So really trying to make sure there's no untapped population of people and making sure they're aware of what our services are. But a lot of our services can also be provided online, so they don't have to come into our offices like they may have needed to before.
All right,
Thank you.
I'm gonna let, are you set?
I was just gonna, it looks like we're out of time. I can catch these guys some other
Yeah,
time.
I think we're gonna stop it here because we have another thing starting in 10 minutes. But
Yeah,
I just, or you can catch folks out of the.
Yeah, we're happy to stick around. We don't have
But I
any.
appreciate you coming in and boy, if it is just another department where, thank you for coming out of the rabbit hole. I saw
Happy to
you
be
going
here. Thank you.
Deeper and I was empathizing with you.
Yeah.
Because you want to be able to explain it the right way, but I appreciate that you said it in English. Legalese or laborese, so.
Yes, sir.
But thank you for coming in as an introduction. Now, committee, we know what our folks look like from the Department of Labor. You'll see them in the building. And when we have the labor-oriented issues, again, you'll probably be in Commerce 4 times for every 5 times you're in the building. But we're definitely going to tap Matt Barowitz for because there's a whole workforce question. There's a lot of things. But the labor workforce data that can be provided to us is a whole nother gold mine of geekiness, really, but lawmaking. So thank you.
You should all feel free to reach out to us anytime with specific questions. I saw a couple of hands still up, so even if we don't come back, if you have a specific question, we're happy to answer it, either Cameron or I.
Thank you.
Yeah, great. Thanks, everyone.